Victoria, the Victoria and Albert Museum is the UK's National Museum of Art, Design and Performance, and the National Art Library is the library within that structure. So we have about 1 million books, and we are quite young in that we were started in 1837, and we have a very broad remit to cover all of the interests of the museum. So our collection is diverse and idiosyncratic, and we are very interested in issues of provenance concerning how such a collection has been built up in a comparatively short space of time and at some of the most problematic periods of history. So we are very interested in Nazi-era looted books in our collection, and we are most certainly interested in colonial legacies. So I have to admit that I submitted a title for this seminar fully intending to talk about 4 objects to illustrate different problems that we might have researching provenance. But because I have made little progress on one particular item in the last couple of weeks, I'm going to indulge myself by talking about that in a slightly more reflective way. Oh, let me just... There, that's what I hope. You can hopefully all now see the image of the item that I want to talk about. It's an Ethiopian religious scroll. The images I've put together there don't really give you a very good sense of its structure because it's 1.2 meters long. It is stitched together from 2 pieces of parchment. It is an illuminated manuscript written in Ge'ez, the language of the Ethiopian church. It's decorated throughout, but then it has these 3 very striking images of saints holding a sword. So the script is a combination of prayer and other text to protect the holder from harm. The very edge of the scroll shows clear evidence of it having been ripped or torn from an original setting into which it was stitched. This is the entry for the item in the museum's accession register from 1868, where you can see it is described wrongly as being in Amharic with coloured figures of angels. It is noted there that it is Abyssinian. The register mentions nothing further of the provenance, but everyone working in this museum in 1868 would have been aware of a British military campaign in Abyssinia, in Ethiopia, in 1868, which had already, by the time we paid for this scroll, had already yielded very considerable holdings to this museum. I'm not going to talk about this military operation at great length because it is something that a great deal has been written about, but the image you can see there is a print of the British assault on the Abyssinian mountain fortress of Magdala in an operation that was explicitly stated was about reinforcing British national pride. Lieutenant General Sir Robert Napier took 13,000 British troops, 20,000 other people, 40,000 animals, and walked them 400 miles across North Africa to attack this mountain fortress held by Emperor Tawadros II of Abyssinia. In the battle, the British deaths numbered 2. The deaths of Ethiopian fighters were not counted or recorded, but are estimated to be in the low thousands. The expedition had taken with it a manuscript curator from the British Museum to assist in identifying cultural goods. And After the culmination of this attack, which included the complete destruction of all buildings, it took 15 elephants and 200 mules to carry away the British Army's loot from Magdala and from the surrounding area and every church and palace within reach. All of which was auctioned off at an official British Army auction a short distance away, and at which the British Museum curator bought many objects, and from that auction they have been dispersed into many national collections within the UK. So we know that that is where this scroll has come from, and the V&A has reflected very long and very publicly about being an inheritor of a colonial legacy. The image you can see there is of a dedicated display that the museum put on a few years ago, and you can see in the center of that case the scroll that I'm talking about. So that unspeakably violent origin is unquestionably the most important thing about the provenance of this item. But I think it is also interesting to consider the many routes by which these items then ended up in collections in Britain and elsewhere, both in the months that followed the expedition, but also for decades afterwards, often having passed through multiple hands, having been received, sold, purchased, gifted. How they were handled and regarded and valued when they made it back to Great Britain is, I think, a key part of that colonial narrative. So this scroll was purchased by the museum just 6 months after its theft in Ethiopia. But I really wanted to see if there was anything that we could find out about its journey here. So the only record, the only surviving formal record we have of its purchase gives us the name of the man from whom we bought it, Mr. W.H. Saunders. Saunders isn't listed in any available directory of book dealers, art dealers, antiquity dealers. And at first it really seemed hopeless to understand how we had come to purchase this item. But written in pencil on the reverse of this scroll, of this sacred text, you may not be able to read it in that image, but it says Private Goodwin, and there is a second line underneath. That identification with the British soldier has been enough to link this scroll to another exercise in British national identity. In the northern city of Leeds in West Yorkshire in 1868, where a national exhibition of works of art was mounted in the shell of a just completed hospital. It was explicitly described as a way to show off the cultural wealth of the United Kingdom and its imperial possessions, but also to demonstrate that art and culture were not restricted to the capital in London. So among all of the items lent by the royal family, by aristocrats, by the most wealthy businessmen in the United Kingdom, there was, in the 2 weeks before the exhibition opened, a sudden rush of offers to be exhibited by local people. And none of those items appear in the official catalogue of the exhibition because it was too late. But the National Art Library has internationally significant holdings of material relating to national and international exhibitions. And we have a much scarcer later second edition, months after the exhibition closed, which sets out in fact, 21 Abyssinian items from 4 military lenders, including 8 scrolls. But here, what you can see is the 7 items lent to the exhibition by Private T. Goodwin of the 3rd Dragoons. And the last item there is 4 manuscript charms, which is what they're describing the scrolls as. You can also see the deeply dismissive description there of rude illustrations of saints. So here you can see this is the receiving book of the National Exhibition of Works of Art, where they are signing in the items from T. Goodwin. Interestingly, he seems to have not had an address to provide for them. He provides a proxy for the exhibition to return these items to. So I think it's interesting in that it explains a little more about the history of this scroll and the journey that it made from Magdala. But it also shows just how many pieces of Ethiopian cultural property were in the hands of people who were not collectors or institutions in the UK at that time, and how casually and disrespectfully they were being treated and handled. It's also really striking that of all of those items Private Goodwin held, this one scroll has come to the V&A. Nothing else that he held matches our holdings. Nothing else he held is it possible to trace as having survived anywhere in any collection. So either they have all been lost or destroyed, or they've found homes where attribution isn't clear. So the purchase by the museum is just 6 days after the exhibition closed. So clearly some individual saw these items in Leeds and reached an arrangement with their owner to dispatch them to the museum. And again, the V&A records just show that they were purchased from a W.H. Saunders. And the other items he sold us were an exquisite service book, which is still in our collection, which almost certainly was the emperor's own private devotional book, and a silver communion spoon taken from an Ethiopian church. Neither of those items were in the possession of Private Goodwin. And neither of those items were in Leeds. So whoever Mr. Saunders was, he was buying items from multiple sellers and then rapidly passing them on to the V&A. So at this point, I would love to flick through to the next slide and tell you exactly who Mr. Saunders is. I can't in all conscience tell you that I know, but I feel it's this worthy gentleman here. This is William Henry Saunders. He's a high street pharmacist. He is a local historian of Portsmouth, a naval port city on the south coast of England, many, many miles from Leeds, who ultimately served as the curator of that Portsmouth's first museum. So with not very much evidence, I decided to suspect that this was the Saunders that had sold us these items. And he left some material to the city of Portsmouth on his death, but it is at best a chaotic assortment of bits of paper. It's broadsides, prints, engravings, lots of advertisements, lots of election ephemera. It is very clear that he was a man who haunted auction and sale rooms and frequently documented exactly where he had bought things. But he also left some notebooks concerning his work as curator of the museum, listing items that were loaned or purchased, including things that came ultimately from himself. But what I want to highlight at this point is that furthering my research is hard because I am blinded by my own contemporary prejudice. So to be clear, the looting of Magdala was condemned at the time. It was condemned by the British Prime Minister for that matter, but it was entirely legal within the framework of the time. Objects seized in battle or in adjacent areas were legally acquired, and that would remain so for decades in the United Kingdom. All of the national museums of the UK openly purchased material from this looting. But honestly, what makes me want to identify this W.H. Saunders as the man from whom we bought the scroll is partly his aura of dishonesty and crooked practice. So when I first encountered Saunders' notebook in Portsmouth, I found that some of the pages were glued together. And at first I thought that was an accident. But then you could see around the edges of the pages that there was lots of financial transactions being recorded. And I thought, well, maybe he ran short of notebooks and he couldn't be bothered tearing those pages out, and he glued them together and started again. But actually, he indexed his notebooks very carefully. And you can see from the index that what he has glued together to completely obscure is information about items that he purchased and sold to his own museum, which begins to suggest that something dishonest is going on. And then I visited Mr. Saunders' memorial in Portsmouth Cathedral, and here it is, a shiny brass plaque erected by his fellow townspeople, where he is recorded as William Henry Saunders, FSA, which stands for Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, a learned and ancient society in London, which did much to champion archaeological research in the 19th century, except he isn't. He wasn't. There's no record of him at the society. He's lying. Such deception is doubtless not that uncommon, but it colours my perception. And it was all enough to make me investigate what other dealings Saunders might have had with the V&A. So the V&A had lent a substantial collection of items to Saunders to boost his museum collection. But then a senior curator visited unannounced one afternoon and reported, one of our exhibits, a priceless Persian carpet, is much exposed to sunlight and badly faded. The ribs of a mandolin we have lent are covered in mildew, and one of our electrotype dishes is much discolored. Both the museum cases, the building, and the curator's office are filthy. And as usual, a foul smell of fish pervaded the entire place. So the collection was immediately recalled, and we're told elsewhere in the file that Mr. Saunders was much distressed. Now, none of that's criminal, it's just bad practice and ineptitude. But the senior curator goes down one more time and he speaks to a city council employee who casually reports that it's recently been discovered accidentally that the curator replaced a large gold medal in the museum with a gilded plaster cast, and that the original medal cannot be found. The curator has also stated under questioning that he has many objects belonging probably to the museum in his private house. So Mr. Saunders is not what his memorial suggested, but my increasing certainty that this means he's the man we bought the scroll from is, of course, troubling. It's built on my feeling that the trade in this material is immoral and that Mr. Saunders' immorality proves it was him. But in the standards of the day, it wasn't immoral. And moreover, as a museum employee, as a librarian, I need to be alert to the danger that I'm focusing on this dastardly, dishonest curator because it gets me away from thinking about the difficulties of the museum's continued ownership of the item. So am I pointing at Saunders because it stops you pointing at me? The figure of a dishonest curator runs the risk, I think, of offsetting and absorbing the blame that properly belongs to whole systems of which we are all the inheritors. And I think really my incomplete investigation highlights that it isn't just the archive or the institution that we can lay the blame at the door for exercising imperial power dynamics. These colonial legacies play out across a national stage in all of the competing claims to the loot and in struggles of provinces against the capital. But I think really these investigations show how rapidly and multiply these artifacts have got absorbed very reductively into systems of commercial and cultural valuation. And if that story includes criminality and dishonesty and deceit, then I do think there's value in highlighting it as another example of the violence to these objects against which I think much violence has already been done. So it is an incomplete investigation, but I am very happy to take any questions, although I'm conscious of the time.